Hello, I'm Arnold Key. In the first episode of these virtual coffee houses, we talked about the process of applying for financial aid. In this episode, we return to the topic of financial aid, but keying in on a term that is like beauty, whose meaning is shaped in the eye of the beholder. We're talking about need. What colleges think families need and what those colleges are willing to spend on aid seems to be based on factors that would take an expert to figure out. My friend and fellow Tufts Jumbo, Ken Redd, is one of those experts. As the Senior Director of Research and Policy Analysis at the National Association of College and University Business Officers, he is tasked with taking a closer look at those factors. His organization, also known as NACUBO for short, just released an annual report which surveys private colleges and records how they discount tuition. Please join us as we talk about financial aid in a broader context and how that can sharpen strategies for families seeking it. All right, so I'm here with a good friend of mine. He's another Tufts Jumbo, and we've known each other over the years. When I worked at the American Association of Community Colleges, he was in that same sort of policy space that I was in, and so we will bump into each other literally and figuratively in that there are intersections between some of the work that I was doing and work that he's continued to do. But then also I'd see him on the metro every now and again and say, hey, how's it going? So I'm really happy to have Ken on. I'd like for him to introduce himself, and we can say a little bit more about where he works and the people that he serves in his current position. So Ken, please introduce yourself.
Sure. Arnold, thanks again for the invitation. It's really nice to see you again. As you were saying, Ken Redd, Jumbo class of 1987. That sounds strange to say, right?
But yeah, I think that was before the internet.
Right? Yeah, that was before the internet. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But currently, as you said, I since college, I've been in higher education. And currently am the Senior Director for Research and Policy Analysis for a nonprofit association called NACUBO, which stands for the National Association of College and University Business Officers. We are an association of universities and colleges based mostly in the United States. We represent the financial interests of universities. So think tax policy, accounting policy, investments, and what we're going to talk about a little bit more, financial aid from the standpoint of universities. I know that's important to your audience as well. But we do work in higher ed policy and around those areas, advocacy work, as well as measuring some of the impact of institution-based aid programs that we'll talk about, and how schools finance them, and how they impact college affordability. So we cover those and many other areas as well. And I've been at NACUBO since the September of 2008, so going on 14 years now.
Wow, awesome. Yeah, it's interesting that space that we're in. It's one of those. It's an area of work that I don't think people typically are aware of, in that, there's all these people in Washington, D.C. who are working for associations, college and university associations, and it's an alphabet soup of organizations, and many of us are tasked with solving problems or finding answers to questions, for policy questions that are bedeviling colleges and universities. And the work that I did, it's interesting to see how, when you do this kind of work, the kind of insight that you can gain regarding how colleges are run, and again, like what questions they still have to answer. And so, say a little bit about the kinds of questions that people are emailing you, right, and calling you, and they're asking you for stuff. Share a little bit about the kind of questions colleges are typically asking you.
Yeah. So my association, as I mentioned, NACUBO, very much a policy or organization. And a good example is uh, we deal a lot, for example, with taxes and tax policy, and I think a lot of people can relate to that. Organizations have to pay taxes, universities have to pay taxes, people have to pay taxes, right? Most
Right.
people, yeah, and so all of us, universities included, want to make sure that tax bill is as minimal as possible.
Hmm.
So we often get questions about uh, new uh, tax provisions and how Congress might change some provisions that will make either the university's tax bills greater, which we, of course, we try to fight, advocate against, or smaller, which we certainly
Right.
advocate for. Um, and so I and my colleagues will sometimes get email messages either from the members of Congress who are
Mm.
writing tax law, or from university leadership who want our help in how to interpret or navigate through those tax laws. Those kinds of areas. The other area that I deal with more specifically is with things like uh, investments in endowments, which again, there's a lot of advocacy for and around, and uh, parents and schools will email me specifically and ask about, well, how do schools use their endowments, and
Hmm.
what are the types of scholarships or fellowships can students get that are funded by endowments, and
Right.
those kinds of areas. So we touch, while we are focused on policy and policymakers, we often will get email messages and requests from families, from students who are looking to us for some ideas or guidance on how to interpret some of those questions and data that schools and organizations like mine will get related to endowments, investments, taxes, those kinds of things that, as I
Right.
said, all of us deal with, from universities down to individuals.
Okay. Well, that leads us then to the report that that you sent, and that can be uh, the hinge for our conversation today, which is financial aid. So you all do this report every year. So could you talk about the report that you sent, the tuition
Sure.
related report? Yeah.
Sure. This is an annual survey that we do every year called the NACUBO Tuition Discounting Study. And
Okay.
the way to think about it is uh, again, a lot of families want to go to college, are in college, and if you go to college, of course, the one thing you know about is the tuition bill. Like,
Mhm.
university will charge, $20,000, $30,000 for tuition for students going full time. That's very, very typical.
Right.
And of course, we know that many families can't afford, or don't want to pay tuition at that high.
Right.
Especially families, low income families. They look at that tuition bill and say, "Oh no, I can't afford that." So often schools will discount. They'll take out some percentage of that tuition bill that you don't have to pay because it's
Right.
paid for by scholarships or other means.
Hmm.
That uh, a grant or aid that you get off of your tuition bill is called a tuition discount. And so
Okay.
we, for more than 30 years, so before me, this survey started before I got to Kubo. For roughly 3 decades, we've uh, measured how much of these discounts are schools providing to undergraduate students. How big is the discount? Is it, half tuition, three-quarters of tuition? And who gets the discounts? Are they going to students from uh, uh, families with financial need? Are they going to families without financial need, or some combination of those two? So we've used this survey to answer those kinds of questions. As I said, I've worked on it for the time I've been at Nakubo, but we've
Hmm.
been doing this since the mid 90s. We've been doing this survey, so it's going on 30 years, as I said. So we have a wealth of information about that. We have 3 decades of trends that look at each of those areas that I mentioned. So for families, the implications obviously are going to be related to how much aid they can get from these universities,
Right.
and how much of that aid, how much of their tuition will be paid for by this aid.
Right. So yeah, so from what I gathered, you then through these surveys get a good snapshot of what's happening from the university perspective. And
Yeah.
you know, when we think about what it takes for families to pay tuition, we may not be thinking about what it takes for colleges and universities to provide whatever aid they provide on the other side of it.
Right.
So my thought was that, with your perspectives and with the perspective of the survey, we could get a better sense of, what is going into the calculus from the college and universities perspective on what they offer.
Right.
So, could you chat a bit about some of the key findings that you were able to draw from the survey results?
Yeah. So I should back up slightly and mention right away. The one thing I didn't say about our survey is we only survey private universities. So we don't do public universities, even though we know
Okay.
public universities also provide grants to students. But our focus is private universities.
Okay.
But within private universities, what you said is very true. So from uh, from one perspective is the protection of students, of course. From the other perspective is the private colleges that we survey. How are they generating the revenue that they use to award these grants to students? And we know it's a substantial amount of money. Private universities, if you look at the data from the College Board, collectively they award well over 100 hundreds of millions of dollars in grants to students every year. And in fact, the private college grants are often bigger than grants that you receive from the federal government through Pell Grants and other federal programs. So institutional funding is very important.
Mm.
In our survey, we ask schools how they fund their grants to students. And it tends to be from a number of sources. I mentioned endowments. Endowments fund, roughly 10% or so of the grants that students get. There's also funding from fundraising. So when a school calls and says, hey, we're raising money for scholarships for students, that funds another 10 to 15% of the grants that students get. But we found that more than half of the grant aid that these schools provide comes from what's called undedicated, which essentially means that it's an amount that they don't have a specific pot of money that they provide these grants from. They provide it from, they either just simply waive the tuition, so they essentially means that it's money that they were never expecting to collect. It's on the books, but it's not actual dollars, or it's from some other source that is it's not easily categorized or recognized on their financial books.
That sounds a little mysterious.
Yeah, it is. It from the point of view from a family or consumer, yeah, that's a little bit. It does seem a little bit mysterious. But if the analogy is like, so if you and I, like, we create a budget every, you get a paycheck and you create a budget from that paycheck. Certain expenses are going to be covered by like your salary, like your mortgage or your rent and your clothing, all those kind of things. But let's say there's another expense that you get that like your car breaks down or something like that you don't fund that. You get your car fixed, but you don't fund that directly from your salary. You fund it from savings, or you borrow it from your neighbor or one of your friends. And that's a quote unquote undedicated revenue source. It's one that you don't necessarily have a plan for, but you find it, the money's there, you find it, but you find it from some other source that you weren't necessarily expecting to have, and that's how schools fund these grants. They in the
It
financial
sounds
system,
like,
they
you know,
use their credit card, or
right.
they get it from some other. They do some additional fundraising, or they find some other resource. So that's what we mean by. So
Okay.
if you want to draw an analogy, that's kind of what we mean by undedicated revenue source.
This sounds like when you want to go get donuts from that famous donuts shop, and you don't have enough change, and you look through your drawers for enough change, to do that, as opposed to,
Yeah.
again, like having a specific line item to draw it from.
Right. That's exactly right. That's another way of looking at it. Absolutely.
So given what you're seeing regarding, the different places or sources of sources of revenue to fund grants and tuition for students, are you seeing any trends with regard to, increased ability of colleges or decreased ability of colleges to provide funds? Because one thing that's clear is that that tuition has been rising faster than inflation, over the
Right.
years, and so families are having to go into more and more debt in order to pay for tuition.
Yeah. So I think, yeah, I want to start there because I think that's a really good point. From the standpoint of families, our surveys actually has a lot of good news. What we found is that um, universities typically, for first-time freshmen, for the new entering students, the first-year undergraduates, schools typically discount about 54% of their tuition for those students. So in other words, schools may say they charge a certain amount, and they may plan to collect a certain amount of tuition from their first-time freshmen, but in actuality, they collect 54 or 54 or so percent less than what what they say they will collect. For families, that means essentially that whatever they think they're going to pay that much less. And in fact, what we found in our survey is that 9 out of 10, nearly 9 out of 10 of first-time freshman students will have gotten a grant. And this is as of the 2021-22 academic year. So it's very recent data. So there's the message that we're giving is that the odds are really great if you're a parent of a student thinking to go to college, or a student in college, and you're wondering, is my child going to get financial aid? The answer is yes.
Okay.
More often than not, you have a 9 in 10 chance of at least getting a grant from your school.
Mm-hmm.
And that grant covers, as I was saying, it covers an increasing amount of the aid. I'm sorry, of the tuition price. And in fact,
Right.
for many families, those discounts, the aid is more than 60%, to 62, 63% of the tuition price. So $6 out of 10
Mm-hmm.
are of their tuition is actually basically being paid for by the schools in terms of their financial aid. Now, that still doesn't mean, that's still, like, if you look at the tuition price, right? The tuition price may be $30,000. If schools are covering 60% of that, that still means you have to that family has to come up with 40% of
Right.
that $30,000, which is still a good bit of money. So it doesn't mean that families aren't borrowing or don't have to borrow. They still have to. And plus, we're talking just about tuition. There's also room and board and those kind of things that they're covered by, have to come from some other source for the family. So the need for financial aid is still great. Families are still borrowing, and we definitely are recognizing those other expenses. But as far as tuition is concerned, a good bit of that is covered by these financial aid programs. So that's really the number one finding of our study is the impact on students and this is just, like I said, these are
Yeah.
grant dollars. These are dollars that families don't have to, not unlike a loan, a grant or scholarship is money that students get without having to repay or worry
Mhm.
about the payment. Is quote unquote free money is the term that a lot of families use. And these universities are providing a lot of these free dollars
Yeah.
for students and their and paying their tuition.
Right.
So yeah, so I hope that answers at least from that perspective, and
Right.
answers your question, what the
Right.
impact is.
Yeah. It does sound like, based on what you're saying, that colleges are offering discounts when it comes to price versus family contribution, as it's called.
Mhm.
So that's great.
Yeah,
However, one open-ended question for me is, and maybe you can answer it, or maybe you have a comment, but they do whatever they offer is based on some kind of formula, right?
right.
So, if you're applying for financial aid through, a financial aid form, the university gets that, they get your declaration of income and such, and
Yep.
they respond to you, or respond through, the federal government, to say, okay, this is what we expect you to contribute.
Right.
Somewhere along that process, families are still getting sticker shock, because
Yeah, for sure.
what they think they're supposed to contribute is a lot less than what the colleges
Yeah.
believe they should be able to contribute. And I
Right.
believe that breakdown in communication revolves around the word need.
Yeah.
So a lot of colleges will say, well, we will meet, 100, we'll meet X% of your need.
Yeah.
Or some will say, well, we will meet all of your need. So still apply to us. And so you do that. And then you
Yeah.
get back the result, and you think, oh, wait a minute, no, I need a lot more than what you just offered me. So
Right.
what is happening there?
Yeah, no, I think those are all fair points, and maybe to unpack that. I think what you said, it happens a lot. So in terms of institution and federal-based financial aid, you're right. The process is like, to get one of these institutional scholarships that I was just talking about, you do need to apply. That's the first step. You need to apply for financial aid. You need to fill out what's called the free application for federal student aid, or FAFSA. And every school pretty much requires you. That's the first step. You fill out that financial aid form, you send it in. And as you said, once that's done, after a while, you get a number in the, and you get a number in the mail that's at least currently, and this will change, but you get what's called a student aid index, which is a number that basically says, your cost of college is, $50,000 all in, room, board, tuition, etc. We think, based on what you have provided on the financial aid form, that you can pay 25,000 of that, and financial aid from the federal government institution grants, so it will cover the other 25,000. And a lot of families say 25,000, that's a lot of money, and it is for
Mhm,
sure. How
mhm.
do they figure out, especially for, like, and there are differences, right? The school, uh, how do they figure out this $25,000 number, and why is that even close to being realistic? For many
Right.
families, it's not. And I
Mhm.
think the truth of the matter is, Arnold, and I think families should understand this, that those formulas, as much as Congress has tried to tweak them or whatever, and schools try to tweak them, they're really, they're no more than rationing devices. They're not
Mhm.
really based on most families' realistic living costs, and especially when, like a family in New York has much different living expenses than one in Oklahoma or
Right.
someplace else. Like,
Right.
not those states, but just,
Right.
New York is a very high cost
Yeah.
state, and Oklahoma is, relatively speaking, not a high cost state.
Mhm.
And so what these formulas do essentially is they try to take a limited pot of money and spread them throughout the country to families in California and Oklahoma and New York, and there's only so much money available, so they spread those dollars out as much as they can, and so they ration them. And
Oh,
the formulas are the best are the best way that we know how to ration across, if
mhm.
millions
However
of
many
students going
millions
to
of people.
college.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So,
Uh,
not to sound too cynical about it, but that's exactly it. And
mm,
so for universities, when they figure out the financial aid of eligibility for a lot of these grants, um, uh, unlike the federal government, they will factor in things like your home equity. And we know a lot of homes now, the equity in the homes is greater now than it was a few years ago. So
mm,
that affects your financial aid. It affects that aid index number that I was mentioning. It affects
mm,
that family contribution that you were talking about
mm.
as well. Um, so, and they also will factor in things like, well, do you have outside investments? Do you have, bonds and stocks, all that kind of stuff? Sometimes they will factor in, things like college savings programs, 529, et cetera. Not dollar for dollar, but certainly they will factor some of those in as well.
Mm.
So all those factors come into play in determining who gets this aid and how much they get and all that kind of stuff.
Mm.
So a school really could say, to your last, I'll wrap up with this. Yeah, you're right. A school could legitimately say, based on the laws and the formulas that we have right now, we are meeting your full need.
Right.
But a family will say, well, that's that's
You're
not
wrong.
my need. But by law, yeah, the laws of the land, in the way we set up these systems, yes, the law says this is your need, but we know that realistically, most people would say, well, no, that's only the
Yeah,
need based on the law, not based on the actuality. Is many families couldn't afford to pay that $25,000
yeah.
or whatever the family contribution is that we that we just talked about.
Yeah. So something that's really hit me too, like during this process, is that if it always feels like there are unspoken expectations regarding how a family is supposed to come up with whatever that tuition is that the college says and the federal government says we should be capable of providing. So now, interesting that you just said home equity. Now, it does turn
Mhm.
out that home equity is going up, because from what I understand, the housing there's a housing shortage now,
Yep.
and
Mhm.
so because of the lack of supply, um, and perhaps other factors that a real estate expert could tell me about. Um, Zillow was saying that home equity is going up, but if you were to ask a financial aid officer, like point blank, are you expecting me to liquidate my house to pay for college tuition? I think that they're likely to say no,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
But by the same time, but you just said, and I believe you, you just said that they are using home equity as a way of determining what your need is. So that sort of gap in
Yeah.
explicit expectation communication there, um, is a
Yeah.
little troubling.
Yeah. And it's troubling still because, just to take a step back, the universities are using home equity to determine eligibility for financial aid from their resources, from the school's resources. The federal government, of course, for Pell Grants and student loans doesn't consider home equity. So that's why this is disconnect. On
Right,
one group is saying home equity doesn't count, another group is
right.
saying, yeah, it does. So that's
Yeah,
what the complication is. And yeah, you're right. If you talk to most financial aid administrators, they'll say exactly that. Like, well, no, we understand that you're not it's not realistic for you to tap your entire home equity to pay for college,
right.
but they would say there is an expectation that you will find some other way to fund that portion. And that other way could be, the student uh, uh, could get a part-time job while they're enrolled, or uh, the family may not get home equity loan, but they may borrow from another resource. They may borrow from their grandparents or from a family friend or something like that. So the expectation, not necessarily that you'll get that you'll tap your home equity, but
Yeah.
that you'll get the value of that home equity from some other resource other than the schools themselves. So that's why it's very complicated. It's a complicated system. And my fear is that for a lot of middle and lower income families who don't have that sophistication, don't have the other resources, don't have family to rely on, are
Right.
already working, 40, 50 hours a week just to meet their day-to-day expenses.
Right.
My fear is that a lot of them, even with the financial aid that schools will provide, a lot of those students from those families will say, no, it's just too hard. It's not worth the extra effort. And so I think a lot of low-income families, even with the financial aid that we have, because of the complication of the system,
Right.
a lot of them will decide not to attend college. And that, to me, that's the saddest thing, because I think higher ed is probably the greatest thing human beings have ever invented, in terms of being an avenue for upward mobility, for taking people from a lower income stratum to a middle and higher income stratum. You really do need that education as the great equalizer. And it doesn't work if families say, hey, this is too expensive, or it's too complicated, I can't figure it out. It doesn't work for low income families as much as it should because of that complication.
Is there any space from your perspective for advocacy to try to bridge that, I'm going to call it a communication gap at this point? Because it just seems that families are being misled about how much need is actually going to be met. And what can happen is, you send your child, let's say, so you have to make a decision in what, April? Let's say April and
Early
May,
May,
right? For your child to attend a particular college or university. So, let's say the year before, you're visiting schools and you're talking with administrators, and they're saying, oh yeah, send your child here, we'll meet 100% of their financial need. And so then you start to feel a little connected to the school, because now it's like you've been there, you've talked to people, your child has visited, you visited, wow, this looks great. And so then, the fall before the decision needs to be made, you start applying to these schools, and you start getting, everyone's getting their hopes up. And then finally you get you get the acceptance letter, right? Especially if it's like a need blind college, you get the acceptance letter and you go, oh, this is going to be great. And so now, you're applying for financial aid and all that. And then, after you're like likely to accept, or I think maybe after you've accepted, you then get the financial aid report. And then the financial aid report says, oh, to attend the school that you have fully committed yourself to emotionally and practically, because you signed the dotted line, you have to pay X amount. And that to me is like a devastating point to be at, because you're already like a year in terms of emotional investment into a child's dream college, or a college that you've designated for whatever reason. Rankings, family history, or the child's own determination as to what they think the best school is for them, whatever that is, you're invested. And so it becomes very difficult now to back away from that commitment.
Yeah, a couple of pieces of advice on that, because the last thing I think, especially if a child, we say children, but these are young, men, young women.
Adult student, right?
Yeah, these are young men, young. But before you, my advice before a potential student gives up on a dream school, the first thing I would do in that situation is call the school's financial aid office and ask them for an appeal, because there are provisions in the law that allow for what's called professional judgment. So what that means is that let's say, like you said, like you apply to a school, you apply for financial aid, and you get your aid package, and it's that big gap.
Mhm.
Oftentimes, what families can do and will do is call up the aid office and say, hey, I got the aid package, but it didn't take into account this change or this factor. Like, for example, like unfortunately, we're still in a pandemic.
Mhm.
Uh, if a parent or a wage earner in the family has gotten sick unexpectedly or had unfortunately had passed away from COVID or from some other illness that isn't taken into account for, you can bring that to the attention of the aid office and say, hey, this
Mm.
happened. You haven't taken this into account. Would you use your professional judgment to make an adjustment in my aid package to make
Okay.
it possible for me to attend the school?
Mhm.
So that's one uh, uh, thing I think definitely regardless, all families I think should do, because you don't have to accept the first aid offer, quote unquote.
Okay.
You can always appeal. You can always ask them to make adjustments based on factors that are unique, that may be unique to you, some changes that you don't think they've taken into account. So that's the first thing I would do. The second thing I would do is also recognize that once you get the acceptance letter, that means that college really wants you. It's sort of like, it's analogous, Arnold, I think, to getting a job offer, right?
Okay.
You get a job offer, you see the salary, that
Mhm.
means they really want you. So you've got a little bit of leverage. You can
Mhm.
say, hey, especially if you've gotten
Other offers.
acceptance offers
Right.
from 2 or 3 other schools, you can say,
Right.
hey, look, I've got these 2 other acceptance offers. I'd really like to go to this school, Tufts, or
Mhm.
of course Tufts. I mean, yeah,
Right. Yeah.
just
Right.
by the way, that should be everyone's #1 school.
Right.
But let's say you go to the financial aid office, say, hey, look, I really want to come here, but I've gotten 3 or 4 other offers. Here they are, and these other offers seem to be better on a percentage wise, seem to cover a greater share of my costs
Mm.
that you're offering. And
Mhm.
can you match or can you exceed these offers? And sometimes they will. Sometimes they will. Again, using
Yeah.
those provisions of professional judgment or appeals process. Sometimes
Right.
say, hey, you know what? We didn't realize you had these other offers. We want you to come here. Here's the adjustment we can make.
Right.
Now, I don't want to oversell these processes.
Mhm.
I, it's rare that they will cover the entire gap. So
Right. Right.
you should, every family should expect to pay something
Yeah.
for this person's or your children's college, and I think that's a fair expectation. No one's expecting it will be completely free,
Right. Right.
but it does have to be reasonable.
Yeah.
And so using appeals processes, trying to uh, 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 negotiate if you have some leverage there. Those are the things that I would try initially if I were in this situation. And finally, I think I do want to highlight that there are many other organizations out there that are, in my mind, fighting the good fight in terms of trying to get attention to these issues. Uh, Lots of nonprofit organizations, lots of scholarships organizations, and I don't want to mention a lot of names. I don't want to sound like I'm endorsing any particular
Sure.
strategy,
Sure.
but I will say, um, calling around to organizations within Washington D.C. You mentioned AAC, the Association of Community Colleges. Other organizations often have campaigns like the Alliance to Save Student Aid, collaboratives between associations to try to increase funding for college. All those organizations are trying as much as they can and we can to bring attention to these issues and try to raise the level of federal and state aid. So I guess this is my long way of saying
Yeah. Yeah.
never give up. I mean, there are lots
Yeah.
of people fighting the good fight, and my advice definitely would be, in addition to calling the school, is also to call some of these other organizations, scholarship providers, et cetera, that you can think of that might be able to give you some advice on how to navigate this process and to narrow that gap from that's called unmet need, that
Yeah.
$25,000 gap that we're talking about, to as
Right.
low as possible so that you can afford the school
Right.
you want to
Yeah.
go
Let's
to.
let's call it parents unmet need, because again, right, from the college's perspective, they've met their obligation based on the
Absolutely.
law,
That's right.
right?
Right.
So
Exactly. That's exactly right.
right. So the other unexplained expectation here too then is how much debt they think parents, families should be
Mhm.
able to endure in
Mhm.
order to meet their half of the need. So I think going into this, um, I remember, I don't want to mention names, but let's just say we were at an event where a diversity recruiter from a very well-known um, college or university in the Boston area. So I kind of narrow it down just a little bit, but people won't know exactly which one I'm talking about. Said when we were thinking about, perhaps sending one of our sons to their institution, said, "Don't worry about the price. Why are you worried about the tuition right now? Don't worry about it." And I just remember feeling at that point, okay, well, maybe we shouldn't. And I think part of that was a belief that because our son was doing so well, and we thought that they had good prospects, that somehow there would be scholarship money, or that there was something that they weren't telling us about how whatever need we thought needed to be met would be met on their end. Um, but yeah, but we came to find out that no, it's not quite like that.
Yeah.
What they're saying is, don't worry about it, because you will probably be able to get a federal loan
Mhm.
to
Mhm.
meet whatever gap there is, and you could
Right.
just pay it off in, over time.
Yeah.
Now, what one thing that we've come to learn, and I'm sure you've understood this as well, is that some families, like what you're able to take out is not necessarily proportionate to what you're really able to pay off in a reasonable
Right.
time.
Yeah.
So they really do let you borrow a lot of money in
Yeah.
order to pay,
Mhm.
pay for college tuition. So
Yeah.
there actually is something to sort of worry about when it comes to what that gap would be. But again, we're just so excited about what prospects there could be. And to your point about upward mobility, those of us, particularly if you've had a chance to go to a good school, recognize the potential for upward mobility,
Right.
um, calibrated somewhat, to the school that you go to. I'm
Right.
not going to say that it is specifically calibrated, but we know that there is some tenuous relationship between um, where you're able to go and what your career trajectory might be
Yeah.
coming out. So I'm,
Yeah.
I'm going to leave it that general so
Yeah.
that I
Yeah.
don't,
Yeah.
oversell that. But with that in mind, you're thinking, oh, this school is interested in my child or my son or my daughter,
Mhm.
and it sort of gins up your belief about what is possible, what is possible for them and what you'll be willing to sacrifice, for them.
Yeah. I think so. What you're describing, the struggle that families, and especially, I'm going to focus on some of the traditional age students and traditional families. You have a 17-year-old, 18-year-old young man or young woman uh, doing college tours, and you get really excited. You go to a school like, a Wellesley or a Tufts or a Smith or something like that. They have beautiful campuses.
Hmm.
And as you said, great faculty. You get it really excited
Hmm.
about, and they get really excited. You get excited for them as a parent. You
Right.
get excited for them to want to have that experience, especially if you've had that experience. You
Right.
mentioned going to Tufts, and Tufts is great school, great campus, all those kinds of things, and you definitely want that for your children. And uh, so I could see a recruiter or somebody saying to you, don't at this point, don't worry about the price, but the truth of the matter is, in my opinion, again, this is my
Yeah.
opinion. I'm not a college recruiter, and I'm like you. I'm a policy analyst. I'm a researcher, and so I try to give advice to people that I think is based on the data and on the experience of being in the policy area.
Mm-hmm.
So from that perspective, my advice is you should always worry about price. You should,
Right.
because you can't be naive to the fact that all those schools that we mentioned,
Right.
uh, their sticker prices are north of $60,000 a
Right.
year. And for
Right.
4 years of experience, you're talking about a sticker price of at least $250,000.
Right.
And you can't dismiss that.
Right.
That's a reality. Now you won't pay that. Like we were talking about financial aid, and a lot of that list price will definitely be covered by grants, the free money. Before, and we'll talk about loans in a moment. But you have to know that in the back of your mind. You have to think, I don't want to get too excited, especially if because I'm not expecting a 17-year-old, right, to think like it. You're the parent, and this is for the audience. Like, you're the parents. You have to make this decision on behalf of your children, because they're still your children, right? And you have to do it in a way that meets some of their needs, but also meets the needs of your household, because kids going to school, you still have to work, you still have to pay your mortgage and those things. So a school often will tell you, yeah, when they get the aid package, you'll sometimes see, as we talked about, $25,000, that gap. And the campus will sometimes tell you, oh, you can borrow what's called a plus loan, a parent plus loan, that'll cover that. And that's true. You can borrow that $25,000, but you have to think, well, I have a mortgage, I might have other credit card payments, I have other car payments. I can't let debt payments exceed 28%. That's the standard usually, 28% of my gross income. If it gets bigger than that, if I borrow $25,000 and I suddenly have to pay another $300, $400 a month in student loans, on top of mortgage, on top of car payments, on top of credit card payments, if it approaches or exceeds that 28% mark, then that is going to hurt my household. I might have other children who are also looking to go to college. I said, I think you have to divorce, no pun intended, divorce yourself from the emotions of being on a beautiful college campus from the finances. You can't, those have to be real. You have realistically have to understand that those are related. And I say that, like I said, I really want every person to go to the school that is a best fit for them. And if the best fit for you is Swarthmore or Harvard, and you get in, I would never tell someone not to pursue their dream. I would say, at least if you're going to borrow that, at least understand what you're getting yourself into. Sit down with somebody and do the math and say, hey, can I afford another $300-$400 in loan payments for 1 year? Now remember, if you're assuming 4 years, that's 25 plus 25 plus 25. You could have $100,000 in plus loans that for one child. And if you have more than one child, if you want both of them to go to I use Swarthmore, I'll stick with Swarthmore. If you want both to go to Swarthmore, that could be 25 times 2 plus 25 times 2. And like I said, I have nothing. I'm using that as an example. I'm not saying that's an exact figure. I'm just saying that you have to keep in the back of your mind that the cost for this in terms of loans and that kind of stuff might be more than you can realistically bear. So at least before you decide to pursue that, at least do the math, at least go to the financial aid office and say, hey, can I appeal this award and ask you to reconsider based on these factors? Then you can get that number down to as reasonable as possible before you decide, yes, I definitely want to go here and I'm going to sign on the dotted line and that kind of stuff. Take some of the emotion out and do the math, do the numbers, talk to experts, talk to other families that have gone through this and see what they've done, and then make an informed decision, I think that's my advice for sure.
That's great. Yeah, well-known author Frank Bruni has talked
Mhm.
often about
Sure,
not getting
absolutely.
connected to one specific college. That's why I kind of kept it as broad as I did, because from his perspective, college makes a difference, but it's not the sole difference. It isn't the sole determinant of one's prospects for the future. And so, so I do get that, and I think it's important for us to keep in mind at the same time that we want to maintain a healthy ambition about where we would want to go, and how to make that happen. But thank you so much. I think this is really good. I think what I wanted to do with in talking with you is to provide a way for people to be even more clear-headed about what's happening on the college side versus what
Right.
we have to compete with on our side,
Yeah.
to make it clear that this idea of need has it's left to interpretation based on three different entities really looking at it: families, the federal government, and individual colleges and universities.
Right.
So
Right.
um, so I think you've done a great job of
Oh,
laying that out,
thanks.
for us. But is there anything else you would want to share in terms of advice that parents should keep in mind as they go through the process?
Yeah, you mentioned Frank Rooney's books, and I've read his column for years. He's a great writer, and definitely would, if folks don't get the New York Times, they can certainly find him online and read some of his columns about college and his book. I think he makes some really good points. So the last thing I want to actually leave folks with that. Um, uh, the last piece of advice that he gives that I will repeat is that yes, going to college is really important, but ultimately, and going to a particular school, does put you on a career path that might be different. But ultimately, you know, English 101, Math 101, uh, History 101, they're kind of taught the same no matter which school you go to, right? So, uh, point being, don't get so caught up on being at one school that you forget that you could go uh, to a less expensive option at least and still get the same quality of education. It might not be the name brand. It might not be Harvard or Yale or Stanford or Tufts, but there are lots and lots of really, really good schools in the United States. A lot of really good community colleges, a lot of really good four-year public institutions, where at the very least you can get some of those basic classes done for a year or two at a much lower rate, and then apply to a more expensive or a bigger name school as a junior or so, and transfer in with some credits. And that will save you, in the end, save you a lot of money. Especially, I definitely want to shout out community colleges who do a great job of doing some of those initial introductory course type trainings and awarding an associate's degree and allowing families to A, save those dollars, and B, transfer into that quote unquote dream school. So you at least get 2 years at those schools, but you don't have to spend all 4 years in one institution. There are lots of choices. Take advantage of the choices and use that to save some funds. And heck, a lot of times students go to a four-year state school or a community college and realize, hey, this is actually a lot of fun too. I hadn't thought about it this way. So, so like I said, just definitely Frank's book gives some of that advice. I definitely want to echo that advice as well. And as I said, just give it a lot of thought and try not to let the emotions uh, overrule that financial obligation, and figure out ways you can either go to a different type of school for a year or two to get those expenses down. I think is a really good idea.
Mhm. Awesome. Thank you so much, Ken. I really appreciate your time. It was great to talk to you again. Uh,
Well, thank you again. I appreciate the opportunity to appear with you on your show, and it's great catching up with you. And go Jumbos! Gotta shout out to the alma mater.
Absolutely, absolutely. It was great talking to Ken as he gave very clear headed advice in a space that often seems mysterious. I'm really grateful. Recapping his takeaways, first, even after an award is offered, there is still room for families to appeal it. And while every family will be expected to pay something, perhaps a family's unmet need could still be fulfilled. Also, when doing the math, if you're going to take out a loan, Ken suggested it not rise above 28% of your gross income. And to be fair, some financial planners suggest that one not take out any loans at all. So this particular decision should be a solemn one. If needed, find a consultant who can help you calculate what you can afford. Lastly, there are a lot of great colleges out there. Don't let the early campus visits or promises from recruiters generate the kind of emotion that will make it more difficult to back away from one particular college if necessary. There will be more on the topic of financial aid and scholarships in future episodes. But for now, thanks again for joining us and take care.